Have you ever felt like certain politicians just don't listen? Like their actions don't really match up with what their constituents actually need?
It does make you wonder sometimes.
Well, today we're taking a deep dive into a potential reason why. It's something called clientelism, and we're going to be focusing on India.
Okay.
We've got some academic articles and some really interesting investigative journalism pieces to guide us. And our mission is to try to understand how this practice, especially cash for votes, impacts Indian democracy. Is it inherently bad?
Right.
Or could there actually be some surprising upsides? We're going to find out.
Yeah, I think a lot of us assume that elections are this straightforward reflection of the people's will, but as we'll see today, the reality is much more nuanced, especially in a vibrant democracy like India.
So let's jump right in. One of our sources, a study from Brown University, starts with a quote that stopped me in my tracks. It says, "All elected leaders buy votes." Even children know that. I mean, wow.
Well, yeah.
Is that cynical, or is that just the reality of things? What do you think?
I think that quote reflects a very real perception on the ground in India. It really highlights this tension between India being a democracy, at least on paper,
Right.
and the reality of how elections actually play out.
Yeah.
Are they truly free and fair? There's a lot of debate about that.
And this Brown University study goes on to dive right into this practice of clientelism.
Yeah.
So for those of us who might not be political science experts, can you explain what that is? What is clientelism?
Sure. In simple terms, clientelism is like a transaction between politicians and voters.
Okay.
Politicians will offer individual incentives, favors, or sometimes just straight up cash in exchange for votes.
They're buying votes.
Exactly. It creates this situation where votes become commodities to be traded rather than these genuine expressions of political preference.
This isn't just some fringe theory, is it?
No, it's not.
The Brown University study points to Freedom House's 2022 democracy score for India, and it's a bit concerning.
It is a little bit concerning. Yeah, they scored 66 out of 100, which puts them in this partially free category.
Right.
And one of their weakest areas is safeguards against corruption.
So that's a bit of a red flag.
It is, yeah.
But even before we get into the ethical implications, I just want to talk about the scale of this.
Mhm.
Because another one of our sources, a report from the Carnegie Endowment, mentions some mind-boggling figures when it comes to the cost of elections in India.
The sheer amount of money involved is unbelievable.
Really?
Yeah, the 2009 election cost an estimated $2 billion.
Okay.
2014 jumped to $5 billion.
Wow.
And then, get this, by 2019, it's estimated to have reached $10 billion.
So much money.
It's almost as much as the U.S. spent on the 2015 and 2016 presidential and congressional elections combined.
Wow.
But India's GDP is a fraction of the size.
Right.
So it's a huge amount of money.
So India is pouring tons of money into its elections. But the Carnegie Endowment piece doesn't just focus on the amount. They raise serious concerns about the lack of transparency in how all this money is used.
Right. Transparency is key to a healthy democracy.
Absolutely.
But in India, it's almost impossible to track where all this money comes from and where it's going. It's a giant, opaque, black box.
And that makes it ripe for corruption.
It does.
They even talked about how some recent attempts at reform, like these electoral bonds we keep hearing about, might have actually backfired.
Yeah, that's right. Electoral bonds were actually introduced to try and make campaign financing more transparent. In theory, they create a digital trail for all these donations.
Okay.
But the catch is that this trail is only accessible to the government, not to the public.
So wait, even though they were designed to make things more transparent, they've actually made things less transparent.
It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by drilling more holes.
Oh.
The intention might be good, but the execution,
Not so much.
not so much. And to make matters worse, the government also removed limits on corporate donations. And they got rid of these requirements for companies to actually disclose their political giving.
So essentially, they made it even easier for corporations to pump tons of money into the system without any real accountability.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those concerns about democratic erosion.
Right,
Without transparency, how can voters hold politicians accountable?
right. Okay, so we've got this big picture. Elections awash in cash, shrouded in secrecy. But let's zoom in a little bit and see how this clientelism actually plays out in the real world.
Sure.
The Brown University study highlights a particularly stark example from the 2024 Maharashtra state elections.
Okay.
The Economic Times found that in certain rural areas, payments of just $18 to women voters were enough to swing the election in favor of the BJP party.
Wow, $18.
$18.
That's less than a tank of gas in a lot of
I
places.
know. That's shocking to me. It really highlights just how vulnerable certain demographics are to this kind of financial influence.
It does, especially when elections are so close.
Right.
It raises some really difficult questions.
Absolutely.
The Brown University study brought up a particularly interesting point. What if, in some cases, this clientelism is actually giving a voice to groups that have been traditionally marginalized?
Okay. So on the one hand, we have this system that just feels wrong, like inherently wrong.
Yeah,
But then on the other hand, you're saying these small payments might be the only way certain groups, like those women in Maharashtra, feel like their voices are being heard.
it's complicated. There's no easy answers. We have to consider the potential for short-term empowerment versus the risk of long-term dependency.
That's where our next source comes in.
Okay.
A blog post from South Asia at LSE argues that this focus on cash transfers might actually be distracting from more sustainable solutions for these marginalized groups.
That's an interesting point.
They say that if we focus too much on just handing out cash, it could actually divert resources away from investing in things that could actually lift people out of poverty for good,
Yeah.
like education, healthcare, job creation.
Right.
So it's like giving someone a fish instead of teaching them to fish.
Exactly. It might be a quick fix to win votes, but it doesn't address those underlying issues of inequality.
And a lack of opportunity.
Right.
So it feels like we're uncovering a pattern here. It's not just about individual politicians trying to buy votes.
Right.
It's about a system that incentivizes this type of behavior and maybe even perpetuates some deeper societal problems.
It's a really important point. Clientelism isn't just a surface level issue. It's a symptom of deeper inequalities and these power imbalances.
So if we really want to address this, we need to go beyond just reforming election laws.
Yeah.
We need to tackle those root causes, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Investing in things like education, healthcare, job creation, strengthening social safety nets, all of that's essential to create a more level playing field.
Right.
When people have more economic opportunities, they feel less vulnerable, less likely to be swayed by these short-term handouts.
Okay, so that's the long-term systemic approach. But what about in the immediate term? Are there specific measures that can be taken to make elections more free and fair?
Yeah, I think one of the key areas we need to focus on is strengthening institutions that promote transparency and accountability.
Like independent election commissions.
Yeah.
Ones that can actually oversee the process and make sure everybody's playing by the rules.
Exactly. We also need robust anti-corruption agencies with the power to actually investigate and prosecute people who are engaging in these illegal campaign practices.
And of course, a free and independent media plays a really important role here,
Absolutely.
holding those in power accountable.
Yeah, a vibrant media can be a watchdog,
Right.
keeping a close eye on how elections are conducted and informing the public.
About any irregularities or potential abuses.
Right, exactly.
But strong institutions aren't enough on their own, right? We also need to empower citizens to be more informed and engaged.
You're absolutely right. Voter education is paramount. People need to understand how the system works, their rights as voters, and the importance of making informed choices free from coercion.
So it goes beyond just knowing the names of the candidates on the ballot.
Yeah.
You have to understand their platforms, their track records, where their funding comes from.
Right. It also means fostering this culture of critical thinking and civic engagement. People need to feel empowered to question their leaders, to hold them accountable, demand better.
All of this sounds incredibly challenging, especially in a country as vast and diverse as India. But it feels like these are really essential steps if we want to see real progress towards a more just and equitable democracy.
It's a complex undertaking for sure. But I think what's important is that we shift the conversation away from simply condemning clientelism as this inherently bad thing and start looking at it as a symptom of these deeper, more systemic problems.
Because if we don't address those underlying issues, it feels like we're just putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to a really dramatic example of this cash for votes phenomenon in action. The 2008 scandal that rocked the Indian parliament.
Ah, yes, the Indian Express article. It really paints a vivid picture of this whole incident.
It does.
It reads like a political thriller.
It was a crazy moment. Imagine 3 BJP MPs right in the middle of parliament.
Oh, wow.
They stand up and wave around stacks of cash. They accuse the ruling Congress party of trying to bribe them to win this really crucial vote.
Oh my gosh, it's like something out of a movie.
And the investigation that followed was full of twists and turns. Police were called in, arrests were made, charges were filed. It was a huge scandal.
So what happened? What was the outcome of all of this?
Well, this is where things get interesting. All of the accused were eventually discharged, and the seized money, wait for it, was deposited into the Prime Minister's Relief Fund.
Oh, wow.
Talk about irony.
So a scandal that begins with allegations of corruption ends with the money going to charity. It's almost too crazy to believe.
It really speaks to the complexities of this whole issue of clientelism. It's rarely a clear-cut good guy versus bad guy situation.
It seems like the lines between what's acceptable and what's not are just so blurred.
They are. And this case highlights the need for clear rules, strong enforcement mechanisms
Right.
to try and prevent these sorts of things from happening in the first place.
Okay, so we've talked about the dark side of electoral financing in India. We've seen how cash-for-vote schemes operate, the challenges of transparency, this complex debate about the empowerment of marginalized groups. I guess the question now is, what are some potential solutions?
Right.
What can be done to break this cycle of clientelism and ensure that elections are truly free and fair?
Well, there's no magic bullet, of course.
Right.
But there are a number of strategies.
Okay.
It often requires this multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
You have to address the symptoms and the root causes.
All right, so let's break it down. What are some of the key areas that need to be addressed? Where do we even begin? Feels like such a massive problem.
It's a huge challenge for sure, but I think the first step is just acknowledging that this practice of clientelism, it's often a symptom of deeper issues.
Social and economic issues.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So any solution we come up with, it has to address those root problems, those underlying problems.
So it's not as simple as just tweaking election laws.
No, we have to think bigger. We have to think more holistically. If people are just struggling to make ends meet, they're going to be more susceptible to these kinds of quick fix solutions that politicians offer.
Right, they need that money right now.
They do, yeah. Investing in things like education, healthcare, job creation, strengthening social safety nets,
All that good stuff.
all that good stuff, that can really reduce people's vulnerability, create a more level playing field.
Makes sense. If people have more opportunities, they're less likely to be swayed by, a small cash payment or the promise of a favor.
Exactly. It's about empowering people in a meaningful and lasting way, not creating a cycle of dependency.
Okay, so that's the long-term stuff. But are there any more immediate steps we can take to make elections just cleaner and more transparent?
Absolutely. I think strengthening institutions that promote accountability is crucial.
So like independent election commission.
Yes, exactly.
With real power to oversee things and enforce rules.
Exactly. We also need anti-corruption agencies that have the resources and the independence to investigate and prosecute.
Anyone who's engaging in these illegal practices.
Exactly.
And I think we've talked about it before, but a free and independent media also plays a huge role.
Absolutely. A vibrant media landscape.
Keeping a close eye on everything.
They're like watchdogs.
Right.
They hold those in power accountable and keep the public informed.
About any shady dealings, any abuses.
Exactly.
But even with all of that, the strong institutions, the media,
Yeah,
we need to empower citizens to be more discerning voters, right?
absolutely. Voter education. You can't overstate how important that is. People need to understand how the system works. They need to understand their rights as voters.
Right.
They need to understand the importance of making these informed choices. Choices that are free from coercion or any sort of undue influence.
So it's more than just recognizing a name on a ballot.
Right, exactly.
You need to do your research.
Yes.
Understand their platform, their track record, where their money's coming from.
Right. It's about critical thinking, civic engagement,
Yeah.
people feeling like they can actually question their leaders.
Hold them accountable.
Demand better.
It's funny, as we're talking about all this, I keep thinking back to that quote from the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
All elected leaders buy votes. It's cynical, but the more we learn about all this, the more I wonder if there's some truth to it.
Yeah, it's a question that we should all be asking ourselves, really. I mean, if the very foundation of our democracies is being chipped away by these kinds of practices, what does that say about the future?
Yeah.
What does that say about the future of democracy itself?
It's a little bit scary. But I think it's a call to action. We can't just accept this as like, oh, well, this is how it is.
No.
We need to demand better.
We do. We need to demand better from our leaders, from our systems,
Absolutely.
from our institutions.
I totally agree. And I think the solutions we've talked about today, they offer a path forward. They show us how we can start to address this problem. We have to tackle those deeper issues that make people vulnerable in the first place,
Right.
you know?
Strengthen our institutions.
Yeah.
Empower citizens.
It's a lot.
It is?
This whole deep dive has really been eye-opening for
That
me.
too.
I mean, just the complexity of clientelism and its impact on democracy, not just in India, around the world. It's clear there are no easy answers.
No.
But you know what gives me hope? The fact that we're having this conversation,
Yeah, actually.
shining a light on these issues.
Awareness is the first step.
It is. We can start to move towards a more just and equitable future, I think.
I agree. I think the solutions are out there. And by engaging in these discussions, by demanding better from our leaders, and by actively participating in the democratic process, I think we can create a world where every vote truly counts.
That's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of clientelism in India.
It was my pleasure.
We hope this has sparked your curiosity, made you think a little bit about these challenges that democracies are facing around the world. And until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop questioning.